let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. We have now crossed into territory that would have been unthinkable in a functioning democracy just a few years ago. A sitting president is openly pushing rhetoric that directly tests the loyalty of the United States military. And at the same time, political actors on the other side are publicly telling service members to defy the chain of command. And everyone is acting like this is just another Tuesday. It is not. This is how systems break. Quietly at first, then all at once. Because think about how insane this moment actually is. The military, the one institution that is supposed to remain insulated from partisan warfare, is now being dragged straight into the center of America's political deathmatch. You have Trump framing vast segments of the government as illegal, treasonous, fascist, or the enemy. And at the same time, you have political figures telling soldiers that they may need to refuse orders from the commander-in-chief. That is not normal. That is not healthy. That is not stable. That is exactly how you fracture a nation at its most sensitive pressure point. And if you're watching this and feeling like you're taking crazy pills, you are not alone, because the gaslighting here is on an industrial scale. We're being told simultaneously that Trump is the ultimate strongman who alone can restore order, while his own rhetoric and the political chaos around him are actively undermining the very concept of lawful command. Make no mistake, you cannot claim to be the law and order president while encouraging a climate where half the country believes the government is illegitimate and the other half is openly debating whether to follow military orders. That is not leadership. That is controlled demolition.
And honestly, the casualness of it all is the most terrifying part. The way these warnings are being absorbed into the daily news cycle like background noise, as if the possibility of military defiance, of institutional rupture, is just another political talking point. It's not. This isn't politics. This is existential. This is the structural integrity of the United States being stress tested in real time. Here is the reality that Trump and his enablers don't want you to see. You cannot flood the public with nonstop claims that elections are fake, courts are corrupt, agencies are criminal, and the president is a tyrant, and then act shocked when people begin to question whether the system itself should be obeyed. He didn't just say it, he meant it. For nearly a decade, he has trained his base to believe that no authority is legitimate unless it serves him. And now that logic is metastasizing outward straight toward the military. Let that sink in, because once the idea takes root that obedience depends on political allegiance rather than constitutional duty, the damage is no longer theoretical. It becomes operational. It becomes logistical. It becomes a question not of if a fracture happens, but when and where. And that brings us to the real problem. This moment isn't about one video. It isn't even about one statement. It isn't even about one president. It's about a country being pushed incrementally, deliberately, toward a scenario where the chain of command itself becomes a partisan battleground, where loyalty to the Constitution is replaced with loyalty to a person, where every order is filtered through ideology instead of law. We are not staring at random chaos. We are watching the early tremors of a systemic stress event. And the people lighting these matches want you exhausted, confused, and normalized to the danger, because once the danger feels normal, resistance feels unnecessary. But wait, it gets worse.
Yeah, so if you're new to keeping plants, try something like a snake plant or a ZZ plant. They're pretty easy to take care of. Let's talk about what actually detonated this moment, because the details matter, and the details completely demolish the spin. What set this off was a coordinated political video released by several Democratic lawmakers, many of them with military or intelligence backgrounds, telling service members that they have the right, and in some circumstances, the duty to refuse illegal orders. Now, on its face, that statement is not radical. It is literally embedded in military law. The Uniform Code of Military Justice makes it clear, unlawful orders are not to be followed. That principle exists precisely because of history, because of Nuremberg, because of war crimes, because blind obedience has consequences. But here's the part that Trump and his media echo chamber seized on immediately. They didn't engage with the legal principle. They didn't debate the nuance. They went straight to the most incendiary possible framing. Democrats are telling the military to rebel. They're calling for mutiny. They're undermining the commander-in-chief. And just like that, a constitutionally grounded discussion was laundered into a narrative of sedition. And Trump didn't just amplify that lie. He weaponized it. He publicly labeled the lawmakers involved as traitors. Traitors. Let that think in. The sitting president of the United States openly calling elected officials traitors for restating black-letter military law. And once that word is out there, once you use that language, you've crossed a line that you don't get to uncross. Because now the frame is no longer legal debate. The frame is enemy designation.
Now here's where it goes from reckless to outright dangerous. After Trump's comments, federal agencies moved. The FBI requested interviews with those lawmakers. The Department of Defense announced it was reviewing whether one of the senators, Mark Kelly, a retired Navy captain, had violated military law by participating in the video. Read that again. A retired officer, now a senator, is being reviewed by the Pentagon for reminding troops that they must not follow illegal orders. This is what authoritarian pressure looks like in a democracy. You don't start with tanks. You start with investigations. You start with chilling effects. You start with the message, speak carefully or else. And here's the gaslighting part, because there is always gaslighting. Trump's allies immediately claimed this was about protecting the chain of command. Give me a break. These are the same people who applauded when Trump told his supporters to fight like hell. The same people who excused January 6th as legitimate political discourse. The same people who cheered when Trump openly pressured state officials to change election results. Now, suddenly, they care about institutional stability? Spare me. Make no mistake, they are not defending the chain of command. They are defending personal loyalty to Trump. That is the only loyalty they recognize. And here's where the hypocrisy becomes impossible to ignore. Trump has spent years telling his followers that federal agencies are corrupt, that the deep state is the real enemy, that the military leadership is infested with woke generals, that courts are rigged, that elections are fake. Over and over and over again, he has told tens of millions of Americans that the legitimacy of the United States government itself is suspect. Then the moment lawmakers warned soldiers about illegal orders, suddenly Trump becomes the high priest of institutional reverence. It is laughable. And honestly, it's pathetic.
Because you cannot run a sustained propaganda campaign against the legitimacy of the state and then act shocked when people start debating whether the state's commands are legitimate. That is not an unintended side effect. It is the logical outcome of the narrative he has been peddling. And it gets even more revealing when you look at the language Trump used. He didn't say these lawmakers are wrong about military law. He didn't say they misunderstand the UCMJ. He went straight to character assassination, traitors, enemies, sedition. Why? Because he understands something very important, something he learned on January 6th. Words create permission structures. When you label someone a traitor, you're not just criticizing them, you're justifying action against them. Now let's talk about the so-called chain of command argument, because this is where the logic completely collapses. In the U.S. Constitution, the president is commander-in-chief, yes, but that authority is not absolute. It is bounded by law. Orders must be lawful. Congress has power. Courts have power. A military member swear an oath not to the president, but to the Constitution. That distinction is not academic. It is the firewall that prevents a republic from becoming a personal dictatorship. And yet, Trump's rhetoric deliberately erases that firewall. He speaks as if loyalty to him is synonymous with loyalty to the nation. Disobedience to him, in his framing, is treason. That is a fundamentally autocratic conception of power. And now, under his influence, that conception is being injected into the public debate about the military. Here is the reality that his defenders don't want you to see. No one in that video told troops to defy lawful orders. No one urged a coup. No one called for rebellion. They restated a duty already enshrined in military ethics. The only reason this has become a national crisis is because Trump needs it to be one. Chaos is not a byproduct for him. It is a political asset.
And think about how this plays out psychologically. You have service members watching the news. On one channel, they're told Trump is the rightful strongman whose authority must be absolute. On another, they're told they must be vigilant against unlawful commands. Meanwhile, Trump is actively labeling elected officials as enemies of the state. You are creating cognitive dissonance inside the very institution that requires clarity and unity to function. That is not accidental. That is destabilization. And then you add in the media ecosystem that thrives on outrage. Headlines screaming about mutiny, pundits talking about civil war conditions, social media flooded with absolutist takes. The temperature spikes, the nuance vanishes, and suddenly a principle that has guided military conduct for generations is recast as an existential threat. Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. Trump is cultivating an environment where the only acceptable military obedience is obedience to him personally, not to the law. And at the same time, his political opponents are forced into a defensive posture where even pointing out legal reality is framed as subversion. That is a trap, and it's a trap that erodes the bedrock of civilian control of the military. And that brings us to the most dangerous contradiction of all. Trump claims to be restoring strength. He claims to be making America respected again. But real strength is institutional stability. Real deterrence comes from clear lines of authority, from a military that is apolitical, disciplined, and rooted in constitutional law. What he is doing instead is turning those lines into fault lines. He didn't stumble into this. He didn't misunderstand it. This is not a gaffe. It's not an error. It's a feature. Because a fractured system is easier to dominate than a unified one. A confused chain of command is easier to bend. And a population that no longer agrees on what is lawful is a population that can be pushed into conflict without even realizing how it got there. And that brings us to the deeper, more unsettling truth. This moment is not isolated. It is not spontaneous. It fits a pattern that has been building for years. Say next, and I'll expose how this exact strategy has been used before, how Trump has escalated it repeatedly, and why this is not a coincidence, but a long-running playbook. Because once you zoom out, once you pull back from this single flashpoint and look at the full arc of Trump's behavior, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. This is not an isolated controversy. This is not a misunderstanding. This is not a one-off rhetorical excess. This is a strategy that has been tested, refined, and escalated over years. And every time the same playbook emerges, undermine institutions, delegitimize authority, personalize power, and then dare the system to stop him. We've seen this movie before, over and over. Trump didn't wake up one morning and suddenly decide to test the limits of civilian control over the military. He has been stress testing every democratic institution since the moment he entered politics. Courts, elections, law enforcement, intelligence agencies, state governments, the press, Congress. One by one, he has taken each pillar of democratic governance and subjected it to the same corrosive tactic. If it doesn't serve him, it must be corrupt. If it constrains him, it must be illegitimate. If it contradicts him, it must be an enemy. And every time, the goal is the same: to shift public loyalty away from systems and toward him personally. Let's start with the most obvious historical parallel, January 6th, because this didn't begin with rhetoric about the military. It began with rhetoric about elections. For months before the 2020 election, Trump primed his supporters with one singular message: if he loses, it's fraud. Not maybe, not we should investigate. Fraud. Zaranye. He created a reality in which the only legitimate outcome was his victory. And when he lost, he didn't challenge the results through lawful means like every other losing candidate in modern history. He launched an all-out assault on the legitimacy of the electoral system itself. He called state officials and pressured them to find votes. He sued in dozens of courts and lost. He attacked judges by name. He demonized local election workers. And when every lawful avenue failed, he turned to the mob. Fight like hell. Those weren't metaphorical words. That was a directive, wrapped in plausible deniability, but recognized by his followers as a call to action. And the result was an attempted disruption of the peaceful transfer of power for the first time in American history. Now here's the key point. January 6th wasn't just a riot. It was a failed loyalty transfer. Trump was trying to replace loyalty to the Constitution with loyalty to him. He didn't want his supporters to trust state officials. He didn't want them to trust courts. He didn't want them to trust Congress. He wanted them to trust only him. And when the system resisted, when Congress reconvened, when the courts held, when the military did not intervene on his behalf, he learned something critical. He learned where the red lines were. And more importantly, he learned where they weren't. Fast forward, look at what happened after. He didn't retreat. He escalated.
He ramped up attacks on the FBI as a criminal organization. He labeled federal prosecutors as political hitmen. He called judges corrupt when they ruled against him. He implied generals were traitors. He accused intelligence agencies of running shadow governments. This wasn't random venting. This was a sustained narrative campaign designed to rot public trust from the inside. And every time he did it, the consequence was the same. Millions of Americans became less willing to accept outcomes they didn't like as legitimate. The social contract began to fray. Now apply that exact same method to the military. For years now, Trump has been soft sabotaging military leadership. He mocked fallen soldiers. He called POWs losers. He said generals were overrated. He accused top brass of being controlled by defense contractors. More recently, he has leaned hard into the idea of woke generals, sabotaging American strength. Again and again, he has planted the idea that military leadership cannot be trusted unless it is personally loyal to him. That's not criticism, that's pre-delegitimization. And here's why that matters so deeply in this moment. When lawmakers warn troops about illegal orders, they're operating within a military culture that has long taught this exact principle. This is not radical. This is foundational. But Trump has spent years priming his base to hear that warning, not as a legal safeguard, but as an act of rebellion. So now when this principle resurfaces publicly, it detonates inside a narrative environment Trump himself constructed. This is what strategic destabilization looks like. You don't destroy trust in one day. You poison it gradually. You introduce doubt, then suspicion, then acceleration, then crisis. And look at how Trump's allies respond in every phase of this cycle. When he attacks institutions, they rationalize it as mentally tough negotiation. When the institutions resist, they call it sabotage. When the sabotage narrative sticks, they move to retaliation. Investigations, threats, loyalty tests, punishment.
That's exactly what we're seeing now. The FBI's involvement, the Pentagon review, the public branding of political opponents as enemies of the state. This isn't about correcting misinformation. It's about enforcing obedience. And this playbook is not uniquely American. We've seen it in Hungary. We've seen it in Turkey. We've seen it in Russia. In each case, the sequence is consistent. First, you convince the public that institutions are corrupt. Then you convince them that only one strong leader can fix it. Then you turn loyalty into a personal pledge. And finally, you criminalize dissent as treason. Make no mistake, Trump is not inventing new authoritarian techniques. He's importing them into a democratic system and testing how much the structure can bend without snapping. Now let's address the most unsettling continuity of all, the use of crisis as political fuel. Trump does not de-escalate, ever. When confronted with fallout, he does not reassure. He provokes, because crisis works for him. Fear works for him. Polarization works for him. The more Americans see each other as existential threats, the easier it is for him to position himself as the only protector. Every escalation follows this same arc. He creates or amplifies a conflict. He claims victimhood. He frames resistance as a coup or sabotage. He calls for loyalty, and he dares the system to stop him. And every time the system hesitates, every time it acts cautiously, slowly, deferentially, he learns how far he can go next. Now think about what happens when that exact strategy reaches the military. The final institutional firewall, the last line separating political chaos from physical force. If you undermine elections, the damage is political. If you undermine courts, the damage is legal. If you undermine the military, the damage becomes irreversible. Because at that point, power is no longer theoretical. It becomes operational. It becomes kinetic. It becomes a question of who gives orders and who follows them.
And that's why this moment feels different, because it is. The rhetoric has shifted from the system is unfair to the system is illegitimate, from the judges are biased to the generals are enemies, from the election was rigged to the chain of command is suspect. Each step removes another layer of shared reality. Each step moves the country closer to a point where the basic rules no longer command universal acceptance. And the scariest part, large portions of the public have been conditioned to accept this as normal political discourse. They hear words like traitor tossed around casually. They hear institutions described as enemies. They hear loyalty framed as a moral absolute. And because it happens every day, the shock dulls, the danger normalizes, the unthinkable becomes routine. That's how democratic erosion actually works, not through one catastrophic moment, but through 1,000 tolerated violations. And here's the reality that Trump's defenders don't want you to see. Even if you support him politically, even if you share his grievances, even if you despise his opponents, the structure he is attacking is the same structure that protects everyone from arbitrary power. Once that structure is weakened, it does not magically reassemble itself depending on who wins the next election. Damage at this scale is cumulative. Institutional trust, once broken, does not regenerate overnight. This is why scholars of democratic breakdown warn that the military is the ultimate tipping point. Once soldiers are forced to choose between law and personality, the republic is no longer operating under stable constitutional governance. It is operating under conditional legitimacy. And that is exactly where Trump is pushing the country, deliberately, methodically, relentlessly. He didn't stumble into this moment, he built it. And now we arrive at the most urgent question of all. What happens next if this trajectory continues?
Make no mistake, if this trajectory continues unchecked, the outcome is not abstract. It is not theoretical. It is not a political parlor game. The endgame of this road is a country where force replaces law, where loyalty replaces legitimacy, and where every political dispute carries the latent threat of physical rupture. This is not alarmism. This is how democratic collapse actually unfolds, slowly enough that people argue about whether it's even happening, right up until the moment it can't be reversed. Because here's the terrifying reality of where this pattern leads. Once a president succeeds in convincing a meaningful portion of the population that the system itself is illegitimate, every tool of that system becomes optional. Elections become conditional, court rulings become suggestions, oversight becomes sabotage, and military obedience becomes a matter of personal allegiance. At that point, you no longer have a republic governed by rules. You have competing claims to authority, each backed by its own narrative of righteousness. And that's when fracture becomes inevitable. History is brutally consistent on this point. No democracy collapses because one leader announces dictatorship on day one. It collapses because institutions are hollowed out first. Trust is stripped away. Shared reality is destroyed, and then when a crisis hits, and one always does, there is no longer a neutral referee capable of holding the system together. Every side believes it is acting in self-defense. Every escalation is justified as preemptive. The descent becomes self-fueling. This is why the military question is so explosively dangerous. The military is the one institution that, by design, must remain politically neutral to prevent the conversion of political conflict into armed confrontation. Once that neutrality is degraded, once it is reframed as choosing sides, the final guardrail is compromised.
Let's be extremely clear about what's at stake.
If even a fraction of service members begin interpreting orders not through the lens of constitutional law, but through the lens of political loyalty, you no longer have a unified chain of command. You have competing chains of allegiance. And once that happens, the question of who controls force becomes contested. That is the threshold that separates tense democracy from internal conflict. And here's where the gaslighting becomes truly grotesque. Trump and his allies will continue to insist that they are defending order, that they are preventing chaos, that they are standing against subversion. But their entire strategy depends on manufacturing a crisis large enough that extraordinary measures feel justified. They need the public to feel permanently under siege so that every ethical line becomes negotiable, every institutional restraint becomes expendable. This isn't politics. This is structural extortion, because the genius and the cruelty of this method is that it forces the system into an impossible dilemma. If institutions push back hard, Trump's camp screams tyranny. If institutions respond cautiously, he exploits the hesitation as weakness. If the agencies investigate him, it's witch hunts. If they don't, it's license to escalate. The trap is designed so that every outcome benefits the destabilizer, and the public feels it. You can see it in the exhaustion, in the numbness, in the growing acceptance that chaos is just the permanent background condition of American life. That is the most dangerous shift of all, because a citizenry that no longer expects normalcy will stop defending it. And that's how the unthinkable becomes possible, not in one dramatic collapse, but through quiet acclimatization to disorder.
Now here is the part that cannot be sugarcoated. If this continues, the future doesn't arrive as a single cinematic breaking point. It arrives as overlapping failures, conflicted command structures, competing legal interpretations, public defiance of rulings, political violence that feels sporadic at first, then normalized. The kind of environment where everyone insists they are defending democracy while actively dismantling the conditions that allow it to function. And yes, civil conflict does not have to look like 1861 to be real. It can look like sustained institutional paralysis, regional defiance, armed intimidation without formal declarations, a slow bleed of legitimacy until the idea of a shared United States becomes more symbolic than operational. Let that sink in, because once that happens, there is no clean reset button. You don't wake up one morning and simply restore norms. Norms only survive if enough people continue to believe in them at the same time. Trump's project is, at its core, a campaign to break that synchronization, to ensure that Americans no longer agree on what the rules even are. And here is the reality his defenders don't want you to face. This approach does not protect his supporters from instability. It does not insulate red states from consequence. It does not shield ordinary people from the fallout of institutional collapse. When trust and law disintegrates, it disintegrates for everyone. Markets fracture, public safety erodes, federal authority weakens unevenly, power migrates toward whoever can exert it locally, and ordinary citizens, regardless of party, pay the price. Trump may believe he can ride this chaos to permanent personal power. History suggests otherwise. Once a leader turns a democratic system into a loyalty contest, they rarely remain its final master. Strong men create openings for stronger men. Authoritarian systems devour their architects as often as they reward them.
So this is the line in the sand. Not a partisan line, a structural one. A question of whether the United States remains a country governed by shared rules or becomes a battleground of competing loyalties. If you care about democracy, even imperfect democracy, even frustrating democracy, this is the moment that requires vigilance. Not performative outrage, not social media theater, but actual sustained defense of institutions, law, and constitutional boundaries. Because once those collapse, they do not politely wait for us to rebuild them. They never do.